In this video, we're going to talk about the technical implementation of the ddslick plugin as it relates to RackForms. So if you're not familiar with the ddslick plugin, it's a really cool jQuery plugin that allows us to create dropdowns which contain an image and some text. They're implemented in RackForms by way of an additional JavaScript library. So if I select a page and then go to my JavaScript block, under included additional JavaScript library, I've selected ddslick. So what does including ddslick do for us? So if I actually run this page and look at the source code of it, essentially when we include an additional JavaScript library like this, we are getting a block that we place at the very top of the page, which generally will include some script sources to the plugin in question. And so in this case then we're calling out to code.jquery.com to get the version 2.14 of jQuery, and then we're also calling a local include for the actual ddslick library. Now, oftentimes when we have, and I should say in the majority of times when we have a plugin like this, we'll also have a text description of how we actually use the plugin. So we're not really going to talk about this in this particular example, but if you follow these steps here, usually we should get up and running. And if you're ever in doubt here, you can always load up the ddslick plugin example job by simply opening load example job and typing in dd, and then usually ddslick will appear. And you'll get a fully working example as we have right here. So really what we want to talk about in this video then is how we actually supply data to the ddslick plugin. And I should mention before we actually dive in here that this will require experience programming JavaScript and familiarity with JavaScript concepts like JSON data blocks. So if you don't really have that, this probably won't be a whole lot of use to you. Again, it's mainly meant for using this plugin and actually manipulating the data. So with that kind of out of the way then, we have two main methods that we can use to populate the ddslick dropdown. And so just as a quick preview right here, if I save this form, I have one right here which is using some built-in static data, and then one right here which is actually using a dynamic call to the database. So let's take a look at each of those. So in the first example, what's key here is to know that when we instantiate this plugin, as we can see right here, one of the parameters that we pass to it is a structure of data, and that structure should be in JSON format, and in this case it's called dd-data. So at some point I've defined a data structure called dd-data, and what's nice about using code blocks in RackForms, as we've done right here, is we can kind of create a separation of duties. So if I actually go one up right here, here in fact then is that dd-data structure. So as you can see then, it's typical JSON, and it really consists of a text value, a value, a selected status, false by default, a description, this is optional, and an image source where we actually point to the image for that dropdown. And as we can see here then, these values match really cleanly to the actual dropdown itself. The text value is going to be placed in this line, a description underneath it. Again, description is optional, so if you don't provide one, the text line will simply be bigger. The image source, and its value in the back end. Now, real quick note about the value property right here. We have access to either the text description or the value when we actually process this field out. So in other words, if I select something like Facebook right here, what's actually happened in the back end, if we actually look at our code right here, is the plugin has a function that we can call called onSelected. And when we call onSelected, we're setting the value of this field equal to the value of that selected item. And if we actually look at this right here, this field, its ID, my custom dropdown value, is indeed what this is using right here. In other words, we're setting the value of this hidden field equal to the field that we've selected. Okay, so that's the first way. In other words, we can essentially take this and hand edit this JSON right here to be whatever we want. So if I didn't want Facebook with an exclamation point, I can simply remove that, and now when we preview that, the exclamation point is gone. So we can add new rows to this, delete them, and change them as needed. Generally speaking though, we're going to want our JSON to be slightly dynamic, and that's what method 2 does. So essentially what we're going to do in method 2 is we're going to write a bit of custom AJAX call to call out to what we're going to call our ddslick database driver page. So just to look at the actual calling code first, I have here essentially the same code as we had in this item right here, sans supplying a ddslick data structure. And the reason why is because we're using an AJAX call defined right here to actually grab that data structure dynamically. So if we look at this code right here, we're using a simple AJAX call, and its URL is going to be calling out to database driver.php, and that's what this page is right here. In this case, we're not passing a parameter, but we could certainly do that and pick that up as a get parameter within our form right here. On the done function then, we're going to take whatever we've gotten back, and in this case it's going to be a JSON data structure, and we're going to call the function create dynamic dropdown. And of course that function is defined right here. Create dynamic dropdown then simply replaces what we had in this first example, that raw DD data JSON structure, with the dynamic data that we've gotten back from our AJAX call. So if we actually look at this then, what we're expecting to see is from our database driver.php page, we're expecting to call out to something that creates JSON for us. And indeed, when we actually look at our function, that's exactly what this does. So this page is pretty simple right here. It simply contains a query item. If we look at the query item, we're selecting ID, name, and email from the FB demo table. This is a table that is installed by default with RackForms. This is a great place and is a great place to do some experimentation with. And the real magic then happens when we scroll down to our code to run after query, where we essentially create a JSON response. So I create an empty array right here to hold our response, and then for every row that we've returned from the database query, we're going to create a temporary row array item and assign those 3 or 4 fields, depending on the, or excuse me, in this case 5 fields, that we expect to have with our JSON response. So again, here's text, value, selected, description, and image source. And we just apply those values equal to whatever our database row for that particular iteration is. We then push that array to our row array. So at the end of this loop, we're going to have a big array filled with essentially, it's going to be a hash of hashes. And then finally, we call a header call to tell the calling page that we're going to return some JSON. We're going to then JSON encode using the built-in PHP function that original array response. We're going to have essentially an array of JSON items. And then finally, we call exit. And in fact, if we actually run this page individually here, you'll see that the only response we get back is just a raw JSON stream. I should note, however, that one of the special things that we do with pages like this, like driver pages, is we're usually going to make sure the PageNet required / allow direct access is checked. And the reason why we do this is because generally speaking, when we're building jobs in RackForms, RackForms expects each page to be filled out in sequence. So we kind of do that for the sanity's sake and for security, right? You cannot skip around pages in a job. But for jobs like this, where we're actually calling custom pages, we actually explicitly want to be able to call a page out of order. And so that's what checking this box does, is again, it tells RackForms, hey, don't worry if we're trying to call this page out of sequence, that's okay. So at any rate then, because we're returning a JSON response from this, if we go back to original data structure right here, that's exactly what it gets. It's going to pass a JSON response and message, which calls our function, which then in turn populates our data structure. And if we actually preview this form, then you can see that, again, that's exactly what I get. I go into my database and I'm returning a bunch of data. Now, it should be noted, of course, these are broken images because after all, this table doesn't actually have image data in it. Or rather, it's not pointing to actual valid image locations. So it is going to be a little bit hanky just in case in terms of the demo, because we'd actually have images right here. But in a production example, of course, you would actually have a database set up with paths to image on your server. Now, of course, those images can come from one of 2 ways. You could actually have those as physical paths, or you could actually in turn call a database script, which calls in to grab some blob data from your database and then encodes those in real time into base64 image streams. So a lot of flexibility there. So that is our technical look at how ddslick works. Again, if it's a technique that you've been looking to employ, unfortunately, there's no really easy way of doing this just in terms of getting away with creating this data structure, because again, it's not an actual form field. It's like a custom bit of HTML that gets wrapped around so it looks like a form field. So there's a little bit more setup that we have to do, but of course the end result then is we can have drop downs with images in them, which is really, really handy for a lot of applications. Of course, if you ever have questions about this or anything else you see on RackForms, please let us know at info@rackforms.com.